Hi guys, we're going to get started in just a minute or two, so if you want to, with our class number 2 in our mental health series, so if you want to grab a seat, do so. We're going to get the people from outside in and we'll start in just a moment. Okay, come on in and grab a seat. We're handing out, Chad and Brian have got handouts. If you don't have a handout, just raise your hand, make sure we get you one. As you know, this whole topic of mental health we are focusing on because we've recognized as a church what is being recognized nationally and in fact internationally, and that is, through this pandemic, coming out of this pandemic, hopefully, mental health has been a real challenge with the lockdowns. And I suspect that with what I've been reading lately since the war in Ukraine started, that, with the current state of mental health coming out of the pandemic and now, talk of potential world war in connection with the Ukraine, is kind of a doubling down on people's concerns about their safety and security, and I'm sure leading to depression and fear. So this is an ongoing issue, and it's an important issue. And to address it today is our own Heather Frick. Let me give you Heather's background. Heather is an associate marriage and family therapist in California. She is a doctoral candidate at Alliant International University, pursuing a doctorate in psychology with a focus in marriage and family therapy. Heather is currently working as a therapist in private practice. She works with couples, individuals, and families. She works also at a short-term residential crisis facility, short-term residential crisis facility with individuals who are experiencing severe mental illness and addiction. And as part of her internship requirements for her doctorate, she's also providing very helpful supervision and consultation to the New Life Counseling team here at our counseling center. Heather earned her MATS, her Master's in Theological Studies from Westminster Seminary, California, completed a postmaster's certificate in marriage family therapy from Abilene Christian University. One of Heather's passions in terms of this whole topic is increasing awareness about miscarriage and pregnancy loss. And she's currently doing research for her dissertation on the impact of spiritual coping and social support on the father's experience of grief after miscarriage. Heather is married to Brian Frick, our sound guy. You'll often find Heather in the sound booth here on Sunday mornings, helping Brian back there. And they have been attending New Life for almost 10 years. It's unbelievable to me. Before I ask Heather to come up, let me open in prayer and we'll get started. Father, thank you. Thank you for this time we have together to deal with these important topics. And now as Heather comes forward, Lord, we pray that you would speak through her to us, that you would increase our understanding and awareness of these issues, that we might better minister in our families, to ourselves, and in our community. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Heather?
I can put it down. I'll put it down. Thank you. All right. Well, I am excited to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I do like to use a pointer, so I've got that ready here. And I'm excited to just talk to you about some basic mental health, issues or concerns. So kind of give you an overview of what I'll be talking about today. I am going to talk about some general mental health statistics. Shelley touched on this a little bit last week. I'll just go in a little bit more detail. And then I will switch and talk a little bit more about emotions, the importance of mental health, why it's important to talk about mental health and be aware of it in the church. And then if we have a little bit of time, I'll open it up for a few questions at the end. So we can go to the first slide, please. Maybe. I'll just start going. So there we go. So I just want to highlight a few additional statistics, both for adults and adolescents. As you can see up here, there has been a shift in people reporting mental health concerns since the pandemic started. Prior to COVID, you can see that about 1 in 10 people would report some kind of mental health concern, whether it's depression, anxiety, some more severe, maybe mental illness. And since the pandemic, the average is about 4 in 10, but there definitely were peaks more in the height of the pandemic, where around 5 in 10 people were reporting some kind of mental health concern. About 1 in 20 people experience severe mental illness. That's more of like considered bipolar, schizophrenia, some of those more maybe intense DSM-5 diagnoses. And 1 in 15 experience a dual diagnosis, and that is severe mental illness plus addiction. And then one really important thing here is that more than 12 million in 2020 had thoughts of suicide. And you can see that we'll move down to the adolescent category, adolescent and young adults. That's ages 12 through 25. More than 3 million of youth, young adults, in each age group. So that's more than 3 million adolescents, more than 3 million young adults had serious thoughts of suicide. 1 in 6 experienced a major depressive episode. And this is pretty important too, that young adults are more likely than adults in general to report substance use and thoughts of suicide. And suicide, there have been definitely increased rates of suicide, thoughts of suicide, just in the general population. And churchgoers are not exempt from this. So one statistic shows that at least 1/3 of churchgoers have had a close friend or family member die by suicide. So that's kind of important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So if you can see on this graphic here, I want to make one comment about the graphic first. You see up here it says pandemic causes spike in anxiety and depression. One thing that Shelley mentioned last week and that I want to reiterate is that the pandemic didn't necessarily cause. There's no causality really there. For some people, potentially there could be some causality, but in general, Stressors tend to highlight issues that are already there. So the pandemic just provided like fertile ground for issues that were already there to kind of spring up. You can see, this is kind of reiterating things on the previous slide. There's been a significant increase in both anxiety and depression. If you know over here on this graphic, this is about where things were in 2019, just in general, in terms of anxiety, depression, and then anxiety and depression together. And you can see that the bar graphs, like there's significant increase in both anxiety and depression. Through December 2021, the self-reported symptoms of anxiety and depression have increased about 3 to 4 times. There's been increased substance use, increased thoughts of suicide, increased difficulty sleeping and eating, just in general, kind of among the general population. Next slide, please. I want to highlight just some of the most prevalent mental health concerns. Depression and anxiety are probably the things that we have heard about the most, but also thoughts of suicide, general stress, loneliness, sadness, grief. A lot of people have lost a lot of things due to COVID, and it's not just loss of life. There's loss of job, loss of maybe experiences, events, maybe not able to have the same kind of high school experience as you would have in normal times. Other kinds of diagnoses like bipolar, PTSD. And again, I just want to emphasize that churchgoers and Christians are not exempt from this. One statistic shows that at least 23% of pastors have struggled with mental illness, so it would be naive to think that just because you might be a Christian that you won't experience distress. So that's partly why it's important for us as Christians to talk about and think about our mental health. Next slide, please. I just want to talk a minute about kind of the systemic impact of mental health. Mental health is not simply an individual thing. It doesn't impact only the individual person. There's like a ripple effect into families, communities, and things like that. So as you can see on the slide here, individually, if you struggle with mental health, there can be an increased risk for chronic health conditions, cardiovascular disease, increased risk for substance use. This can kind of ripple out into families. Families may end up with greater caregiver responsibilities and increased stress on relationships, marriages, parenting. And then there can be an increase in financial and emotional burden just among the whole family. And this can be immediate family, it can be extended family. There's the ripple effect just kind of affects the family in general. And then it can spread to communities as well. There can be increased social isolation. If you've ever struggled with anxiety and depression, a lot of times people will isolate, which can increase those feelings of anxiety and depression. But communities feel that as well. There can be increased loneliness and withdrawal from community, and community includes church family. So maybe you don't come to church as often, maybe you stay away from your community group, your life group, don't go to the events, things like that. So we as a congregation should be well-versed in emotions and mental health, not only for our own health, but also to be able to walk alongside of others who may potentially be struggling. Next slide, please. Okay, so given these statistics and the prevalence of mental health struggles, the impact that it can have on communities, families, I just want to talk a little bit about a biblical reason for why Christians should pay attention to mental health and emotions. Now, I just want to make a note that this is not intended to be a complete theological discussion of emotions, but it is important to understand briefly how the Bible does address our emotions. So I have 3 just really short points here. First of all, we are made in the image of God. So this includes the emotional part of ourselves. Although God is not subject to his emotions and cannot be overtaken by his emotions and does not act sinfully when experiencing emotions, we do see in the Bible times where emotional attributes are kind of given to God or described. God is described as having certain emotions. Secondly, Bible does talk about our emotions. We don't see the word emotion probably in the Bible, but some words that you might see would be affections, passions, heart. Those are all common terms used to describe emotions in the Bible. So we see that we do see examples of human emotional expression in the Bible. And I just want to highlight a couple of places where you might see this. Genesis, you definitely see, Cain and Abel. I think that is probably a good first example where we see jealousy. In the Psalms, I really love the Psalms because it kind of is like a guidebook for how to bring your emotions to God, how to talk about and express your emotions. Song of Solomon, you see a love between maybe husband and wife. Lamentations, and then in the New Testament, you see Paul and others in their letters talking about how they long to be with the church in these different locations. So not only does the Bible talk about our emotions, we also see Jesus displaying emotions. So just a few examples here. We see Jesus' grief in John 11:35 when Lazarus died. We see his anger. We see that in Matthew 23:33 and John 2. These are examples of Jesus and the money changers in the temple. We see Jesus having compassion in a number of different places. I just listed 2 passages there. And then pain and agony. Definitely before he is about to go to the cross, we see his emotional pain. Now, Jesus, as fully God and fully man, he also felt and displayed emotions perfectly. I think we can look at his example and use it for a picture of how we can display emotions as well and communicate our emotions. Next slide, please. So, given that emotions are part of being human and being made in the image of God, it would seem that we as Christians would have a greater acceptance and understanding of this part of ourselves. However, there have been many negative and hurtful messages that have circulated among Christians related to emotions or mental health. So I've just listed a few of them here. Perhaps you have heard one or more of these. Perhaps you have heard other misconceptions, other things related to emotions or mental health that might not be listed here. But I just want to talk about these 4 here, just briefly. So the first one is, it's best not to talk about it. And I think the idea there is that if you don't talk about it, it doesn't exist, it's not a problem. But the problem with that is that silence breeds shame and isolation. If we are to be fully known and fully loved, like Robin talked about in his sermon today, then there's really not a place for us to be silent about things that we're struggling with. Emotional distress does exist, regardless of whether we talk about it or not. And by not talking about it, we have left many of our brothers and sisters stuck in isolation and spiritual doubt. So it's important to talk about it. Second, struggling with mental health is only a spiritual problem. By saying only, that's very a black and white kind of statement. Sometimes it can be a symptom of a spiritual issue, but sometimes it's more complicated. It would be also naive to think that you can just pray it away. Can God take you or help you with, take you out of maybe depression or anxiety? Yes. And it could also be a symptom of something else going on, maybe something deeper, maybe a medical issue, maybe a spiritual issue. But we need to remember it may not only be a spiritual issue. Third, mental health struggles equals a crisis of faith. Kind of some similar ones to this is that depression is a sign of weak faith, and potentially taking medication for mental illness is wrong. Now, again, this could be true. It could be that mental health struggle is a crisis of faith, but it may not always be true. For some people, it could be trauma-related, it could be medically related. One important perspective that I like to remind myself of, is that mental illness isn't a sign, may not be a sign of weak faith any more than a broken bone, autoimmune disorder, or virus is. Treating mental illness as a sin problem rather than a health problem may prevent many Christians from seeking help or even acknowledging treatable conditions. There are a lot of great treatments for mental health struggles. In addition to medication, there's a lot of great medications. There's a lot of people who are trained to help people and work with people who are struggling with mental illness. So keep in mind that mental health struggle may not necessarily be a sign of a crisis of faith. And then fourth here, God doesn't care about or can't handle my emotions. I addressed this a little bit in the last slide, but we can see in the Psalms that as kind of a blueprint for feeling and expressing a wide range of emotions. Additionally, like I said in the last slide, we're made in the image of God, and this includes experiencing emotions. So to deny our emotional experience is to deny a part of our humanity and our imaging of God. Okay, so now that we've made a little bit of a case for why emotions and mental health is important for Christians to talk about, think about, I just want to talk a little bit about emotions, and I'll primarily spend the rest of our time today talking about emotions. So if you can go to the next slide, please. I just want to give a definition for what emotions are, and my purpose for talking about emotions is helping us all understand a little bit more about what emotions are, what they do for you, kind of where they fit in into who we are as humans. So what are emotions? Emotions are a complex reaction pattern. Well, let me back up. So there's lots of different definitions of emotions, and I am going to go with the APA definition. That's the American Psychological Association. So I'm going to go with that definition and then give some more examples and understanding of kind of what emotions are and how they work. So emotions are a complex reaction pattern involving experiential, behavior, and physiological elements by which an individual attempts to deal with a personally significant matter or event. That's kind of the technical definition. We're going to unpack that a little bit in the next few slides. But essentially, emotions are kind of this rapid, automatic response to some kind of stimuli. And often it's based on an appraisal that you make either consciously or unconsciously of a situation. So along with that, emotions are both cognitive and not cognitive. There's a lot of different theories about, people will make strong arguments about whether they are only in the brain or they're only in your body, but I like to think of them as actually both. So they can start in the brain. We have an emotion center in our brain, the amygdala, the limbic system. They can start there, and then there's like a cascade response after that. But they can also start in the body. These are kind of automatic responses, maybe a response to threat. You can kind of think of this like, I like to relate it a little bit to like an animal who is maybe running for its life. Maybe you have an animal like a zebra running from a lion or something like that. Zebra sees a lion, gets freaked out, runs away. It's an automatic response. Those kinds of things happen to us as humans too. So next slide, please. So emotions do actually have a purpose. And there can be a lot of different purposes, but I want to highlight 3 of them. There's intrapersonal, that's what happens inside of you individually. Interpersonal, what happens in relationships. And then social cultural. So that's kind of the greater community, what kind of the cultural meaning that can be assigned to emotions. So back up a little bit here, intrapersonal, what do emotions do for you individually? They can motivate you to take action. There is, and we'll talk about this in a couple more slides, there is a reciprocal influence of emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. So there's often a pattern that happens. And emotions can also be for self-regulation. And what do I mean by self-regulation? Well, basically, let's say that maybe you have, you've done something wrong, you have a sense of guilt. The response that's prompted from guilt is to go make things right. So that's a way to regulate yourself, regulate your behavior. Let's move on to the interpersonal. So this is relational part of emotions. Emotions help us connect with other people. I'll talk about this in a couple more slides, a little bit more about the function of emotions, but emotions help us connect with other people. If we don't have emotions, you can't connect. It's super important. Also, emotions help us understand ourselves and others better. There's this mirroring thing. I don't want to get too technical, but there's this mirroring thing that happens where if someone else is feeling sad, let's say, you can maybe have empathy for them or compassion for them by kind of feeling a little bit of that sadness with them. So it helps us understand ourselves and others, understand what they might be going through. The social cultural piece is kind of this, what influences how we assign meaning to certain events. There's also this cultural piece that helps us cultivate and maintain relationships similar to the interpersonal. But culture has a big influence in our social circle, our family is the environment that we grew up in, has a huge influence on how we express emotions, what events prompt certain emotions, and things like that. Next slide, please. So one really important thing is that emotions are not necessarily good or bad. If you have read much about emotions in the past, you may have heard emotions described as positive or negative. I don't know that that's necessarily helpful labels. Emotions are not good or bad. They just are what they are. They give us emotion. They alert us to needs or dangers in the environment. And one also important thing is you can't really selectively ignore them. For example, let's say that you maybe grew up in a family where anger was not okay to be expressed. So anytime you felt angry, your parent said to you, stop being angry. That's not something to be angry about. So over time, you will learn that when I feel anger, it's not okay. I'm going to push that down. What happens kind of over time is that other emotions start to be muted or numbed, where you're not able to feel those emotions. So over time, you may have a difficult time feeling much emotion at all. And this goes back to the importance of emotions. It'll be harder to connect with other people. It'll be harder to recognize your own needs. And this does affect our spiritual life as well. It'll be harder to maybe pray or maintain that spiritual relationship with God. So what types of emotions are there? If they're not good or bad, what types of emotions are there? There's essentially two types of emotions. You'll find all kinds of contradictory stuff in the literature if you ever read about emotions. But basically, there are two types. There's primary emotions and secondary emotions. There's a very limited number of primary emotions. Essentially, there are 1, 2, 3, and I'm counting because I had to see how many I put up there. There are also different literature, different authors will include more or less primary emotions. But in general, there's 6 or 7. So happiness or joy, sadness, fear, disgust, hurt and pain, and surprise. Some people will include anger in there as well. I think anger can be a primary emotion, but there's also times when it is not. So primary emotions are essentially our initial direct response to a situation. And then secondary emotions are often a reaction to the primary emotion, where maybe you make a judgment of your initial response and then express or say that you feel one of these more secondary emotions. And I'll show an emotion wheel in a minute, and it will hopefully make a little more sense. So for the secondary emotions, essentially, I just have a couple of examples here. So for example, under anxiety can be fear, potentially fear of losing control. Under anger can be sadness, hurt, guilt. You notice that under each of those secondary emotions is a primary emotion. So if you kind of dig down far enough, you'll get to a more primary emotion. And just a final note is that emotions can be simple or complex. Simple is essentially the primary emotion. A complex emotion could be a combination of multiple different emotions. So if you go to the next slide, I just want to show you an emotions wheel. You'll also find lots of different images of emotions wheels online. But essentially, what I think is important to notice here is that in the center, these are all of the primary emotions. And then these are all like secondary emotions that are a part of each. So under angry could be let down, humiliated, bitter, mad, aggressive, frustrated, distant, critical, and then all of these out here as well. Under happy could be playful, content, interested, proud, and so on. So hopefully that gives you a better picture of kind of how secondary emotions are really part of those more primary emotions. Next slide, please. Just really briefly, I just want to talk about the components of emotion. This was mentioned in the definition of an emotion, but there's often a subjective, physiological, and expressive component to an emotion. So you have, essentially what happens is that you experience an emotion, you have a subjective evaluation of what you think that emotion is, and this is kind of where the influence of your experiences, your memories, culture, family, environment kind of come in. Then there is always a physiological response to the emotion. You may not necessarily recognize this. I think one where a lot of people can recognize a physiological response is probably anxiety. You notice maybe a fluttering in your stomach, really sweaty palms, your voice is maybe a little bit shaky, kind of how I was feeling at the beginning of this. So you get that real physiological response. And then expressive. So this is your behavior. This is what you do in response to that emotion. So maybe you smile, maybe you laugh, maybe you have a big old sigh. And this also can be influenced by your culture, family upbringing, things like that. So one really important thing to notice is that emotions, like a pure emotion, is often short-lived. People often think that, well, if I allow myself to feel a certain emotion, it's going to take over and I'm never going to not feel this way. In reality, what happens is that emotions last only about 90 seconds. if you allow yourself to actually feel the emotion. So it often is like a wave. It might start off slow. There's some kind of peak where you feel a lot of high distress, and then it will go back down. So I think that can be helpful sometimes to keep in mind, is that an actual emotion often only lasts about 90 seconds. So if you can make it through that high distress period and not distract yourself, not push it down, allow yourself to actually feel it, it will fade. It will not last forever. Next slide, please. Okay, like I mentioned, I just want to talk about a little bit more about what is the purpose of specific emotions. And I'll just touch on a few of them here, because I think they're on your handout as well, so you will have access to it. But a couple that I want to highlight is love. Love is really important for connection, bonding. There's hormones that happen in your body when you feel maybe a love emotion that help you connect with other people. Let's see here. Fear. Fear also often warns us of danger. This can be either physical danger, emotional danger, and what it does is it then prompts you to seek safety. So if you are constantly living in a state of fear, your behaviors will probably be prompting you to always be seeking safety. And then one other one here that I want to highlight is sadness. Sadness often indicates that you've lost something important, and it will hopefully prompt you to reach out for support. Now, if over a long period of time you've gotten a message that when you reach out, no one is going to be there, eventually you'll stop reaching out. But I just want to give you an idea of why we have certain emotions. Emotions, they give you information, they also prompt you to do something. So keep that in mind. And let's go to the next slide. So like I mentioned earlier, emotions, thoughts, and behaviors are really interconnected. And I know Shelley shared the 3 trees diagram last week, and you can kind of overlay this image onto the 3 trees diagram. I think I have an image of it on the next slide, but I probably won't go into that in detail. So essentially, emotions, thoughts, and behaviors are interconnected, and it's not a straight line. So it's not that emotions lead to thoughts, lead to behaviors, lead to bodily sensations. Any one of these can influence any other. So I think one really important goal is to start to notice what are the patterns that are present in your own life. What happens for you when you start to feel a certain emotion? What thoughts happen in your head? What do you do? How do you react? How do you respond to that emotion? And often this is something that happens internally, but it also influences our relationships with others. So I would encourage you to start to be aware of what are these patterns that happen in your own life. We can skip the next slide and go to the following one. So I want to leave you with a couple of things. What should our response be to distressing emotions, distressing situations? And there is kind of 2 parts to this, or I'm including 2 parts to this. So there's a part for yourself, and there's a part for others, how to come alongside others. So for yourself, I encourage you to have some awareness of your own emotions and how you respond. This goes back to that pattern that I talked about on the previous slide. Recognize the patterns in your life and in your relationships. Also, I didn't mention this before, but I think it's important. Emotions might not reflect reality, but it might give you valuable information about yourself. So it's important that we're not caught up in our emotions, but still recognize, like, I have these emotions. What's happening for me right now? Why am I feeling this way? And get curious about your own self and your own responses. And then also, as Christians, we can bring our emotions in these really painful places or happy places, like emotions are not always painful, to God. And like I've mentioned a couple other times, the Psalms are a great blueprint for this. There's at least one book that I know of that uses the Psalms as kind of a guide for how to express emotions to God. And then for others, Shelley talked about love, know, speak, do last week. And this is part of what we are also trying to do with our life groups, to be fully known, fully loved, be able to talk about all parts of our lives with people in our church, with other Christians. I would encourage you to come alongside of each other. If you know of someone who's struggling, come alongside them. Listen. Listen to understand, not necessarily to respond. A lot of times when people talk about things that they're struggling with, our immediate response is to want to fix it. And that's not a bad thing. It's not bad to want to fix it for other people because you care about them most likely. But at the same time, they might need you to just listen. They might just need someone who is going to listen, not judge, and hear them, because potentially they haven't had anyone hear them. And it can also prompt us, like being curious about other people's experience can help us empathize with other people, show them compassion, be supportive. We can pray with and for them. The last slide is really just some reflection questions for you. You have these on your sheet, but I would ask you to take some time and think about it. Reflect on your own life, your experience, things that you have learned about emotions, and maybe ways that you have learned to talk about emotions, your own comfortability with emotions, and think about how you can come alongside other people who might be struggling. And then the other thing that you have on your handout is just some resources. We here at New Life also have a counseling center. If you feel like you need some additional support, additional resources, please reach out to the counseling center. You're welcome to talk to me. I'm happy to talk with you. But thank you so much for this time, this opportunity to talk about emotions. And I think we are out of time for questions, so we'll just end. Yeah.